Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of 5 things that you need to know about the forage species that will help you catch more bass. And I'm really enjoy doing these. I think these are pretty helpful. And it's so important to understand where the bait is to find more bass. So today I think what we're going to talk about is gizzard shad. Gizzard shad, for those of you who are not familiar with them, can grow to be quite large, like 18 to 20 inches long. They can live for a long period of time, up to 10 or 12 years, I think it is. And they just get to be really large. They have been introduced all over the United States. So you need to be aware that pretty much wherever you're at, there's gizzard shad, guys. They are not nearly as temperamental when it comes to water temperature as threadfin shad are. And they pretty much live throughout the entire country, including the northern part of the country as well. So you need to recognize, guys, number one thing, that there's gizzard shad wherever you're at, and that they get to be quite large. And because they get to be quite large, in order to mimic them, you probably need to use larger baits. We're talking bigger swim baits, big spoons, big spinner baits, big baits in general. The size that you're probably trying to mimic are those 8-inch gizzard shads, and the fish that feed on them are usually going to be a much larger, a much better quality fish. So you're really not going to be fishing for small fish if you truly are trying to mimic gizzard shad. But no matter where you're at in the country, you have the opportunity to mimic gizzard shad, and they are a really good forage species for larger bass. I would say most of the trophy hunters are trying to mimic gizzard shad at some point, just because they know that a large bass will eat a gizzard shad, but that's like their meal for a long period of time. One gizzard shad really does a lot in terms of filling up a bass's belly. So you just need to recognize that. The second thing to talk about has to do with their spawn process. Now, they are similar to most of the other species in that they spawn in the spring. Once the water temps start warming and they get into that upper 60-degree range, you'll start getting gizzard shad spawns as well. But where they differ is they don't necessarily spawn like a threadfin shad does, which is usually better at night and into the early morning hours. Gizzards start in the evening and go into the first part of the night. That's when their spawn takes place. So if you're trying to mimic that, that's the time period you should probably be out fishing. The third thing is that even though they've been stocked throughout the country as a forage species, what at the time was not understood was that they can be very detrimental to a body of water. They feed on plankton. Well, that's their preferred food source. They feed on plankton, but once the plankton's been brought to a level that's so low, they'll switch over to other things and eat them as well. But because they grow quick, they reproduce well, and they eat a ton of plankton, they can really deplete the plankton source, which is the start of a food chain for a body of water. So it's not unusual to have lakes that have been overrun by gizzard shad, with the rest of the population of fish really being affected negatively. And this has happened throughout the country. There's a lot of lakes that have been overrun with gizzard shad to the point they are really considered a nuisance. So if you are experiencing lakes that have a ton of gizzard shad in it, they could be really difficult lakes to fish, not only because there's a ton of food source, but also because the other species have taken a hit and the populations are lower. So guys, if you're struggling on some of these lakes, if you're familiar with some of these lakes that just have way too much gizzard shad, you may find that the fishing's really poor, and you might want to alter your plans to fish a different lake because of that. So that was the third thing. The fourth thing is, at night, gizzard shad will generally move really shallow, like into, a couple of feet of water. They like to move into usually siltier, muddier bottoms that have some of that slimy weed growth type stuff. That's where they feel comfortable. They are not really night feeders. They feed mostly during the day, but they move shallow to get out of, the way of other predator fish. That's kind of one of their defensive mechanisms. So again, if you're trying to mimic gizzard shad, you may want to think about fishing, at night. And if you are fishing at night, you want to fish in shallow water. That would be a good area to potentially catch a very large bass. If they're up there feeding on the gizzard shad, then that would be a good place to go. So the fifth thing, and this is something that you guys should really pay attention to, and I can't tell you the number of times that this has happened to me across the country with gizzard shad. If you are out fishing, not necessarily mimicking gizzard shad, but you're out fishing and you see a gizzard shad jump, you want to throw your bait in immediately to where you saw that gizzard shad jump. Gizzard shad utilize their fast moving ability and the ability to jump long distances as a way to escape predator. And if you're fishing on a place like Kentucky Lake or the Tennessee River lakes, I know you know what I've seen. You're out ledge fishing, you're in 20 feet of water, and all of a sudden 2 gizzard shad will come shooting out of the water. You may not see a fish chasing them, but they're not jumping out of the water for fun. They're not porpoising like a carp would, just because that's something that they do. They are literally trying to escape predator at that point, so you want to make sure to cast your bait in behind them. And if you get bit, guys, generally it's a very nice fish, just because it's a fish big enough to be chasing those gizzard shad. So you always want to be aware of that. For me, the gizzard shad is not a fish that I necessarily try to target in terms of tracking them as a forage species, because I feel like you're limiting the number of bites. Now, I will say if I'm looking for a big fish, that's a good way to go. But I'd much rather usually key in on like balls of threadfin shad or bluegills, that type of deal. But the gizzard shad really is a species that you need to be familiar with, because it is a good forage species for largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted bass. You just need to recognize that there are a few differences with what they do versus other shad species. But once you recognize that, you can target and utilize that to your advantage. So I hope this was helpful, guys. If it was, hit the like button, share it on your social media pages, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We're going to have a lot more of these similar types of videos coming out, so stay tuned for them. A new video comes out every day. Thanks for watching, guys.